Hello there. It's me, your friendly neighborhood Carlos. Now, before we begin with my grandma's movie-like refugee story, we must establish two things, because without them you might not fully understand the nuances of the story, and because this school project can never actually get decent marks and I'll fail the rest of the year and have a life someday. So, what is migration? Well, by definition,
migration
is the movement of people to a new area or country in order to find work or better living conditions. People from all over the world move from place to place for many different reasons. Push and pull factors are the easiest way to understand why. Push factors push you away from the country, and pull factors attract you to a country. Now, let's say you go to this cafe every day and get a drink and something to eat for about 10 euros. One day you arrive at the cafe and suddenly you pay 10 euros for each of those things. That's an economic push factor, and if you're going to go to another cafe, you'd be considered smart, but also an economic migrant. Now, say there's a Lidl nearby and you start working there from Wednesdays to Fridays. You'd be considered a seasonal migrant because you don't work at Lidl every day. Now, you arrive at a cafe one afternoon to pick up a coffee you pre-ordered and you notice that there are only Asian people inside. There's a worker at the front door and he asks for your passport. After checking, he denies your entry due to not being Asian. You have now no choice but to go to another cafe. You're now considered a political refugee because the owners of the coffee place are racist and have put rules in place that put you at risk, and in this case, literally not being able to even enter. If your friends also join in and start going to Starbucks instead, that's considered a chain migration. Now, finally, imagine you are sipping your coffee one day at the entrance of the cafe gets bombed. Now you're in the middle of a crossfire between this cafe and the rival one across the street. Now, assuming you're not a measly little 3-year-old, I suppose you would try to run away and probably hide away in your home. This would make you a forced asylum seeker. Now, if somehow this small crossfire turns into a nationwide war, then you move to Kosovo, and then you're considered an international migrant. If that conflict lasts decades, and you start forming family outside the original country and many others also, then that would be considered a diaspora. And you'll notice that you'll start to assimilate to the coffee tastes of the Kosovars. Now, before we begin with my interview with my grandma, I'll give you a very oversimplified background to the whole Mozambique and Portugal thing here. Some time ago in a galaxy that is this one, a bunch of kings and queens got tired of being pacifists and said, "Oh, what is this ear-shaped continent over here? I want all. Giuseppe, give me Africa!" And so Giuseppe did. And slowly but surely, Portugal and other nations started to control parts of this ear-shaped continent called Africa. One of those parts was called Mozambique. Portugal really liked this country because it helped them trade their... Giuseppe! Yes, ma'am? The blacks! I need Australia! But ma'am, we don't have enough. What? And I execute him! To this day, Australia isn't Portuguese for that exact reason. Now back to Africa. So then around the 1940s, a bunch of little boys got their hands on some big boy stuff, and 70 million people died. Boys, after all the events of our little play, I believe we don't require the slaves anymore. Yes, of course. Yes, we. No. You see, Portugal at the time was under a dictatorship. One that, in a way, brought a lot of good things, objectively, but definitely a dictatorship. Then in 1964, this guy and a couple others decided that they had enough. I had enough of this! Let's make a coalition to go against the Portuguese! What? Then the two were at war in Mozambique for 10 years, and in 1974, the rule of Salazar ended after the Portuguese shot him with flowers. We didn't shoot anyone. It was you can go read on it. You have the internet. Go find out. The new Portuguese government gave independence to Mozambique, putting an end to the Mozambique War of Independence. And since this is a migration video story, and I'm obliged to add the following. Many people were displaced during this time period from either being violated of their human rights, having better economic opportunities outside the country, and mainly as asylum seekers seeking refuge in other countries, neighboring countries like South Africa, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe were main places of refuge. Many also chose to go to Portugal as they also had family living there. Now we can begin the interview.
Foi só fazer telefonema para ela dizer:
Moçambique.
Vamos sair.
Moçambique é Portugal.
Aquilo que eles gostavam, para eles,
Querida mãe,
eles tiravam da mala.
mando-te este aerograma
E não me diz
para dizer que está tudo bem,
absolutamente nada.
que me diverti à grande. E dei tiros à
Nunca saí
esquerda
daqui.
e tiros à direita. Cacei animais ferozes e também alguns nativos. nosso macaquinho de estimação. Ao partir para ultramar, deixo no cais acenar os pais e irmãos, os avós, lenços brancos a acenar, sem saber se é para voltar ou morrer pela nação. Lenços brancos a acenar, sem saber se é para voltar ou morrer pela nação.
1974. After gaining independence, Mozambique went from a Portuguese colony to an independent one run by Frelimo. Frelimo was a communist party, so their first order? Persecute all Portuguese people, including my grandma and her family. They would go around and arrest people left and right, abusing them and sending them to prison. As an extra layer of control, they would rotate prisoners from town to town on random occasions, like the Russians. Now, what motivated my grandma to move was that at the time she had married, had a 5-month baby coming, and the Mozambican government decided to release a law stating that any kid born in the Mozambique from the time the law passes was property of the state and prohibited to leave the country. So, my grandma's dad decided to go to Brazil. But her brothers who went first sent a message back, saying that it would be better to go to Portugal due to financial complications that would arise from them going to Brazil. This was fine, as they also had family in Portugal. If that law hadn't ever been placed, they wouldn't have moved anywhere else, even with the riots and massacres that happened every once in a while. Why? Because apart from Mozambique being an African country under a communist party, it was a very developed country with an extremely large international community. In a small neighborhood, you could have up to 50 different nationalities, from Brazilians to Germans, Chinese, Russians, Japanese, Americans, Indians, Italians, Vietnamese, Greeks, Indonesians, Spanish, British, and so many more. And more importantly, there was demand for the working class. The economy was great for the time, and most lived a rather comfortable life. Now, when my grandma first moved to Portugal, she was not happy.
Portanto, eu saio de país com tudo, onde fui criada com tudo, e venho para país desconhecido para mim. Falamos a mesma língua, mas tínhamos visões muito diferentes. Eu, quando chego a Portugal, parecia que tinha chegado ao terceiro mundo.
In 1977, they went to live in a village where there was no piped water, no kitchens, and no bathrooms. The only thing that the village had, and that was the only one in the region of Castelo Branco, was electricity. There was no public transport, no development, and little to no commerce. For reference, if you were to compare a flippin' desert, to Portugal, the desert might be more profitable. The big save of the country was this huge immigration from Mozambique, because the international population of Mozambique was much more open to risk and development in the country compared to the Portuguese. Even today, in 2025, Portugal is still as stubborn as before.
Em algumas situações em que eu convivi de perto com a população de cá, onde eles me diziam que o regime era ótimo, e eu ouvia eles dizerem ótimo, quando eles viviam numa casa que nem chão de cimento tinha, só tinha paredes. Não tinha mais nada, não havia água, não havia luz, quase que nem tinham janelas. Ninguém se atrevia a abrir a boca para pedir isto ou aquilo. Claro, depois de uma ditadura ninguém abria a boca, porque as prisões estavam cheias de gente. Quem falasse mal do governo ia logo preso. E muitos foram desterrados e fugiram para fora do país, isto no tempo do fascismo. Nós viemos das colónias com outra visão, mais aberta, e então este país arrancou. Começou a haver estradas, começou a haver comércio, indústrias, pronto, e foi por ali. O teu bisavô foi para Angola com 18 anos. E de Angola, não gostou de Angola, foi para Moçambique e fez lá a tropa. E nunca voltou a Portugal, só em 76, em 1976.
After the independence, my grandma had a comfortable life without any necessary need to move. They had money, but because of the law, they had to move. Now, the same way that you have a limit of cash you can carry with you when going from a country to a country, my grandma could only carry 500 escudos, or 50 euros at the time, about 2 euros and 50 cents in today's cash. So what did they do with the rest of the money? They put it all in the Portuguese consulate, because when the consulate left, that money would be taken to Portugal, and they could then access the money in Portugal. But no, that didn't happen. Why? Because the money never arrived. And they weren't the only ones. After the consulate left, not a penny was ever returned to their rightful owners. Did the money sink into the ocean on its way back? Did someone take advantage of it and take it for themselves? The mystery remains unsolved. This is why the immigrants of Portuguese colonies say that Portugal abandoned them. When they arrived in Lisbon, those 1,000 escudos, 500 per person, was just enough to buy them a train ticket to Castelo Branco. Nothing more, nothing less.
Era a visão, estás a ver? Não há dinheiro, mas nós vamos ao banco, pedimos e vamos investir. Vamos abrir um restaurante, vamos investir numa fábrica, numa pequena... E isso movimentou dinheiro. A mentalidade de cá não era essa, era guardar, mas não investir. Um país não anda sem investimento.
At the time, my grandpa was working at the National Ultramarine Bank and my grandma was studying. Then, after some time, they got married in a rather peculiar way. Now, because the Portuguese Civilian Registration Agency was no longer there, they went to the Portuguese Consulate Agency to inquire about what documents they needed. Now, when they got there, the ambassador tells them,
E diz, é a primeira vez que eu vou fazer um casamento. Não sei bem como é a lei ainda. E lá andou, chamou os funcionários, leu a lei, perguntou-nos que idade é que nós tínhamos. E eu disse, eu tenho 19 anos. O teu avô diz que tinha 22. Então são maiores? Ok. Basta, vamos preencher esta documentação. Ele preencheu, tal. Pergunta, mas vocês querem mesmo casar? Queremos. Está bem. Então preencheu, começou a preencher lá uns papéis e nós a ver.
he calls two workers and say, okay, now sign down here, then here. Okay, you are officially married. What? So that's how they got legally married. But believe me, their wedding story is much better. Now, because they were living in a rather unstable country, my grandpa had a friend that worked at the airport, and they bought 2 blank tickets to Portugal. This friend would keep a hold of these tickets and reserve 2 seats on every flight going to Portugal until the very last second, all of this in case they needed to leave the country. Within the hour, they could tell her that it was then they would go and they could go. And that's exactly what they did. On the day the law passed, they went to the government and renounced their Mozambican citizenship. When they got to the airport, there was a bunch of militants doing a security check. Whatever they liked, they would take and say, this can't pass. When it was their turn to go, they opened their bags and took almost all of the baby things, from diapers to formula to spoons and toys. Then they made their way to immigration, and once again, they were searched and asked for the document of renunciation. They gave the documents and they passed. Everyone got on the plane, sat down, and not a sound was made throughout the whole flight. When they arrived in Angola, they then spent the following 15 hours at the terminal. 2 of the planes then arrived at the airport, also from Mozambique. The small terminal was now very crowded, with 3 planes worth of immigrants in the blazing heat, all waiting for the plane to Lisbon, which had been delayed. People started to leave their things about, the heat unbearable, the food scarce, they were very hungry. Then, over the speaker, they hear someone say that the plane to Lisbon had arrived. Everyone got the few things that they could carry, and most of them left all their jackets, getting onto the plane with just boxers, a t-shirt, and sandals. As all 3 planes entered one of the biggest planes at the time, with enough space to accommodate all 3 planes worth of people, the only thing they asked the attendants is, are we going to be fed? Yes, once we're in the air, we'll provide food for everyone. A couple of people enter, and again, will we be fed? Yes, once in the air, we'll feed you. As all 3 planes found their seats and sat down, there was silence. The plane took off, silence. And only when the plane was out of the Angolan airspace did they start to speak, and people started to be fed.
Como quem diz, enquanto nós não estivermos realmente fora do espaço aéreo, Angolano, antes que o avião voltasse para trás, é que o pessoal vai abrir a boca. Epa, aquele pessoal lá fora, os que andam a carregar as malas, daqueles carros. Olha o frio que lá está fora, até de óculos e máscaras. Ui, vamos morrer de frio.
The plane had to give all their blankets to those people because they would freeze to death if they had gone down to the plane wearing what they were wearing. Then, my grandma and my grandpa got off the plane and with their 1,000 escudos bought 2 tickets to Castelo Branco. And there they stayed. Until now. 50 years. No, this sandwich is really good, bro. I don't know. This sandwich? There you go. Where was it? The issue with the